There was no remorse whatsoever. It was a matter of fact. I got him to kill. He went into great detail on his crimes.
Well, the only thing I know in all is that I killed him.
And that was your intent?
That was my intent.
Sam Little ultimately confessed to 93 murders from 1970 to 2005.
By the time he was put in a California prison for murder in 2005, Samuel Little of Lorain had crisscrossed the country for 35 years and is admitted to killing as many as 90 women. On Friday, he was finally brought to justice for the murders of 3 women here in Northeast Ohio.
In a small interrogation room in Texas, an elderly man sits hunched in a wheelchair. His hands shake slightly as he reaches for a piece of paper. He's 78 years old, with failing health and fading eyesight. But his memory, crystal clear. Too clear. "I can draw them for you," he says quietly to the detectives across the table. "I remember all their faces." What happens next would shake American law enforcement to its core. This man begins sketching portraits. Not 1, not 10, but 93 different women. 93 faces he claims to remember from decades past. 93 lives he claims to have ended across America over nearly 4 decades. His name is Samuel Little, and in 2018 the FBI would make a chilling announcement. Samuel Little is the most prolific criminal in American history. Not Ted Bundy, not John Wayne Gacy, not Gary Ridgway. Samuel Little surpassed them all. For years, law enforcement believed they knew who America's worst offenders were. The Green River case had 49 confirmed victims. John Wayne Gacy had 33. Ted Bundy confessed to 30. These numbers were horrifying enough, but they were nothing compared to what investigators would discover about Samuel Little. 93. That's how many people Samuel Little confessed to harming between 1970 and 2005. 93 mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. 93 lives taken across 19 different states. And the most disturbing part? For decades, nobody connected the dots. Nobody realized that one man was traveling across America, leaving a trail of victims that spanned from California to Florida, from Texas to Ohio. How did he avoid capture for so long? How did he select his targets? And why did it take almost 50 years for the truth to finally emerge? Samuel Little had a method that made him nearly invisible to law enforcement. He specifically targeted vulnerable women, those struggling with substance issues, those working in dangerous situations, those living on the margins of society, women whose disappearances often went unreported, women whose cases went cold before they even got warm. He would approach them with charm, with promises, with a friendly smile. Then he would take them to isolated locations. His method of harm was particularly cruel. He would strangle his victims with his massive hands, watching them lose consciousness. But he did it in a way that left minimal physical evidence. Many deaths were ruled as accidents, overdoses, or natural causes. Some bodies were never found at all. For nearly 4 decades, Samuel Little moved through America like a ghost. Arrested multiple times for various offenses, he would serve short sentences and return to his pattern. He exploited gaps in communication between law enforcement agencies. He took advantage of a time before DNA databases and digital record-keeping. He understood that society's most vulnerable people were also the least likely to be searched for. How does someone harm 93 people and remain free for decades? What failures in our system allowed this to happen? How many of his victims are still listed as missing persons or unexplained deaths? And most haunting of all, Could there be more victims that even he doesn't remember? The story of Samuel Little isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about the invisible people in our society. It's about the gaps in our justice system. It's about how evil can hide in plain sight when we're not looking in the right places. What you're about to hear is the complete story of America's deadliest criminal. From his troubled childhood to his final days in prison. From his first victim to his shocking confessions. This is a story about justice delayed, about victims finally getting their names back, and about the detectives who refused to give up until the truth came out. Samuel McDowell Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. World War II was raging overseas, and America itself was deeply divided by segregation and economic hardship. But Samuel's personal struggles would eclipse even these broader social challenges. His mother was just 16 years old when she gave birth to him. She was a teenager herself, unprepared and unwilling to care for an infant. The identity of Samuel's father remains uncertain to this day. His mother never revealed who the man was, and Samuel would grow up never knowing his paternal lineage. This absence would become one of the defining features of his psychology. Unable to care for her newborn, Samuel's mother quickly gave him to his grandmother, who would raise him in Lorain, Ohio, an industrial city on the shores of Lake Erie. His grandmother was a hard-working woman who did her best under difficult circumstances, but she was already struggling to support herself. She worked multiple jobs, cleaning houses, doing laundry, whatever work she could find to make ends meet. Growing up in the 1940s and 50s as an African-American child in industrial Ohio meant facing poverty and discrimination from an early age. But Samuel's problems went deeper than his economic circumstances. His mother drifted in and out of his life, appearing occasionally, but never establishing a real relationship with him. She would show up for a few days or weeks, making promises she wouldn't keep, then disappear again for months or years. This pattern of abandonment and inconsistency deeply scarred young Samuel. Child psychologists who would later study his case suggested that this early rejection created profound attachment issues. He learned that people were unreliable, that relationships were temporary, that emotional connections were meaningless. These lessons would shape his entire worldview and his treatment of others throughout his life. As a child, Samuel showed troubling behaviors that should have raised alarms. He was intelligent. IQ tests would later show he was of above-average intelligence. But he struggled in school, not because he couldn't learn, but because he refused to follow rules. He was defiant with teachers, dismissive of authority, and manipulative with his peers. His grandmother tried to instill discipline, but she was overwhelmed. She was working long hours just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Samuel was often left alone, unsupervised for hours or days at a time. He would later claim that he spent much of his childhood wandering the streets of Lorain, observing people, learning to read them, understanding their weaknesses. By his teenage years, Samuel had already begun getting into trouble with the law. His first arrest came when he was just 16 years old for burglary. He had broken into a neighbor's home, not just to steal valuables, but seemingly for the thrill of invasion. When questioned by police, he showed no remorse, only annoyance at being caught. He started breaking into homes regularly, developing techniques for picking locks and avoiding detection. But investigators who reviewed these early cases noticed something unusual. Samuel often didn't take the most valuable items. Sometimes he would just rearrange things, go through personal belongings, or simply sit in the homes he invaded. He would later tell investigators that he enjoyed the feeling of power it gave him. Entering someone's private space without permission, being where he shouldn't be, knowing things about people they didn't know he knew. He also began showing concerning behavior toward women during his teenage years. Even as a young man, Samuel was large and physically imposing. He stood over 6 feet tall with powerful hands and a muscular build from manual labor. He learned early that he could use his size to intimidate others, particularly women and smaller men. Several incidents from his teenage years involved him following women, making them uncomfortable, crossing boundaries. There were also reports of violence. A former classmate would later recall that Samuel once got into a fight with another student and didn't stop hitting him even after the boy was unconscious. Teachers had to physically pull Samuel off. When asked why he kept hitting, Samuel reportedly said, "I wanted to see what would happen." By the time Samuel Little reached his 20s, he had already been arrested multiple times for burglary, theft, assault, and fraud. He spent short periods in jail but never faced serious consequences. The justice system of the 1960s released him again and again, never recognizing the danger he posed, never connecting his escalating pattern of behavior. In 1961, Samuel was arrested in Omaha, Nebraska, for breaking into a furniture store. He served 3 months and was released. In 1964, he faced charges for assault in Lorain, Ohio, after a violent altercation outside a bar. The charges were reduced to disorderly conduct. He paid a fine and walked free. Each arrest added to his criminal record, but nothing stuck. He was building a resume of violence and violation, but more importantly, he was learning how to work the system. He learned which stories judges believed. He learned how to appear remorseful in court while feeling nothing inside. He learned that the system had limits to its memory and its patience. During this period, Samuel also began using substances heavily, alcohol primarily, but also whatever else was available. The substances didn't cause his violence, but they removed what little inhibition he might have had. They gave him an excuse for his behavior when he was caught. They became part of his pattern. He also began living a transient lifestyle, moving from city to city, state to state, never settling anywhere for long. He would later claim that his first victim came in 1970 in Miami, Florida, though investigators believe it may have been even earlier. The truth remains uncertain because so much of his early criminal activity went undocumented or unconnected. Samuel himself couldn't remember exactly when he first took a life. The years and the victims blurred together in his mind. Samuel Little's confirmed spree of violence began in 1970, marking the start of what would become nearly 4 decades of terror across America. Though the exact date and victim remain subjects of ongoing investigation, what is known paints a chilling picture of a man who had perfected his ability to find and exploit the vulnerable. By the early 1970s, Samuel had developed a clear and calculated pattern. He was traveling constantly, using the American highway system like his personal hunting ground. He would move from city to city, state to state, never staying long enough to draw attention, never establishing routes that could later be traced. He worked odd jobs: janitor, warehouse worker, construction laborer, always cash under the table, always temporary, always forgettable. His targets were always vulnerable women. This wasn't random. This was deliberate selection based on years of observation and criminal experience. He would cruise areas known for illegal activities, looking for women who were struggling, who were desperate, whose society had already marginalized and dismissed. He knew these women were less likely to be reported missing quickly. He knew their cases would receive less attention from police. He knew that even if their bodies were found, the investigations would be cursory. He looked for women with substance dependencies who might be willing to get into a car with a stranger for the promise of money or substances. He looked for women working in survival situations who couldn't afford to be choosy about clients. He looked for women experiencing homelessness who might accept an offer of a warm meal or a place to sleep. These women weren't chosen because they were easy targets, though they were, but because Samuel understood that society's indifference to their lives would help him avoid detection. Samuel Little claimed that his first victim was a woman he encountered in Miami, Florida in 1970. He described her as being in her early 20s, with dark hair and a slender build. He said he met her on the street, offered her a ride, and drove her to an isolated area near the Everglades. There, he strangled her and left her body where he believed it would never be found. This case has never been definitively confirmed. No body matching his description was found. No missing person report from that time and place matches his account. But investigators believe him because his descriptions of other victims whose identities have been confirmed, are so accurate that there's no reason to doubt this claim. If true, this victim represents the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across America for 35 years. A woman approached on the street, an offer of help or companionship, a drive to an isolated location, strangulation, a body left behind, and then Samuel moving on to the next city, the next state, the next victim. Samuel Little's approach was chillingly calculated, refined over years of practice. He would engage his victims in conversation, often posing as a friendly stranger or offering help. With his imposing physical presence, he was over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 200 pounds. He could also use intimidation when charm didn't work. He would convince or force women into his car, usually an older, unremarkable vehicle that wouldn't draw attention, then drive them to isolated locations far from where they'd been picked up. His method of causing harm was manual strangulation, but he did it in a way that demonstrated both cruelty and cunning. He would strangle his victims until they lost consciousness, but he did it slowly, methodically, using pressure points on the neck that would cause fatal harm while leaving minimal external bruising. This technique was deliberate. Samuel understood that if bodies were found, medical examiners needed to see obvious signs of violence to classify a death as suspicious. Without clear evidence of trauma, deaths might be attributed to other causes. He would later describe in interviews how he refined his technique over the years. He talked about it the way a craftsman might discuss perfecting a skill, showing no awareness of the horror of what he was describing. He explained that he learned to avoid leaving the telltale marks that obvious strangulation would create. He learned to position bodies in ways that suggested accidental death. He learned which locations made discovery unlikely. Some victims were simply left in remote areas where they wouldn't be discovered for months or years, if ever. Ravines, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, industrial zones, places where the homeless often gathered, or where people wouldn't be surprised to find a body, assuming substance-related causes. Others were placed in locations where their deaths could be attributed to accidents or natural causes. A woman left near a highway might be assumed to have been hit by a car. A woman left in an area known for substance use might be assumed to have overdosed. Samuel understood that in the 1970s and 80s, communication between police departments was limited and slow. There was no national database of missing persons. There was no quick way to share information about suspicious deaths across state lines. A suspicious death in California wouldn't be connected to one in Florida unless someone specifically looked for that connection. And why would they? These seemed like isolated incidents involving marginalized women in different parts of the country years apart. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Samuel Little was essentially a nomadic predator, crisscrossing America in a decades-long rampage that left victims in nearly every region of the country. He would spend time in Los Angeles, living in cheap motels and homeless shelters, hunting in areas like South Central and Skid Row. Then he would move to Florida, working his way through Miami, Jacksonville, and Tampa. He'd travel to Ohio, returning to familiar territory around Cleveland and Lorain, then down to Texas, through Houston and Odessa and Lubbock. He worked odd jobs under the table, as a janitor cleaning office buildings at night, in warehouses loading trucks, doing manual labor on construction sites, working in bars as a bouncer where his size was an asset. These cash-based jobs kept him off official records and gave him the freedom to move without leaving a paper trail. He had no credit cards, no bank accounts, no permanent address. He existed in the cash economy, invisible to the systems that track most Americans. Between jobs, he would collect welfare benefits under various names in different states. The lack of computer systems meant that welfare fraud across state lines was nearly impossible to detect. He might be Samuel Little in California, Sam Little in Texas, Samuel McDowell in Ohio. The bureaucracies didn't communicate with each other, and he exploited every gap. He was arrested multiple times during these decades for various offenses: theft, assault, weapons charges, fraud, soliciting. But incredibly, he never faced consequences serious enough to stop his violent pattern. He would serve a few months in county jail, maybe a year in state prison, then be released to continue his activities. The criminal justice system kept giving him chances, and he kept using those chances to harm more people. Investigators would later identify victims from this period in multiple states, creating a map of violence that spanned the entire country. A woman named Patricia Parker in Mississippi in 1982, found in a wooded area, her death initially attributed to natural causes. Another victim, Rosie Hill in Marion County, Florida, in 1982, discovered near a highway. Mary Jo Brosley in Covington, Kentucky, in 1984, whose case went cold within weeks of her disappearance. In Georgia, several cases from the 1970s and 80s would later be connected to Samuel's confessions. In Tennessee and Louisiana, similar patterns emerged. Each case was investigated separately by local police departments with limited resources and no reason to suspect a connection to cases in other states. Nobody saw the pattern because nobody was looking for one across such vast geographic distances and time spans. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to women in their 50s. They came from different backgrounds, different races, different circumstances. But they all shared one thing: vulnerability. They were all women that Samuel believed society wouldn't miss, wouldn't search for, wouldn't fight for. And for decades, he was right. There were several moments when Samuel Little could have been stopped, when alert investigators or determined prosecutors could have ended his rampage decades before it actually ended. But each time, the system failed. Each time, Samuel slipped through the cracks. And each time he walked free, more women lost their lives. In 1982, he was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and charged in connection with the case of a woman named Melinda Rose LaPree, whose body had been found in a wooded area. The evidence connecting him to the case was circumstantial, but significant. He had been seen with her shortly before her But the prosecution couldn't definitively prove he had caused her death, and he was released due to insufficient evidence. This was a turning point that wasn't taken. If prosecutors had pursued the case more aggressively, if they had the forensic tools available today, if they had connected this case to similar cases in other states, Samuel Little's story might have ended in 1982 with a dozen victims instead of 93. In 1984, he was arrested in San Diego County and charged with assault, false imprisonment, and attempt to harm 2 women. This case was even more clear-cut. The women survived and could testify about what Samuel had done to them. They described how he had picked them up, driven them to isolated areas, and attempted to strangle them. One had fought him off. The other had escaped when a passing car scared him away. But once again, the charges were either dropped or reduced through plea bargaining. Samuel served a short sentence for assault and was released. One of the women from these cases would later be identified as a near victim who escaped before he could cause her fatal harm. She was one of the lucky ones. But how many unlucky ones followed because the system let him go? In 1987, Los Angeles police arrested Samuel after a woman reported that he had assaulted her. She described being strangled and thought she was going to die. But the case fell apart when she was deemed an unreliable witness due to her background and lifestyle. The charges were dropped. Samuel walked free. Within months, another woman was found deceased in an alley in South Los Angeles. These weren't just administrative failures or bureaucratic mistakes. These were missed opportunities to save lives. Each time Samuel walked free, he returned to his pattern. And each time, more women paid the price for a system that didn't take violence against vulnerable women seriously enough. By the 1990s, Samuel Little had refined his methods to near perfection through decades of practice. He knew which areas to hunt in, the neighborhoods where vulnerable women gathered, where police presence was minimal, where witnesses were unlikely to come forward. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence, touching as little as possible, leaving bodies in positions that suggested other causes of death, selecting victims whose lifestyles made police suspicious that substances or accidents were involved. He knew which victims would draw the least attention. Women with criminal records, women estranged from their families, women whose deaths wouldn't generate media coverage or public outcry. This knowledge came from experience, from watching how police and society reacted to different cases over the years. He had become an expert in exploiting America's social fault lines. During this decade, he was particularly active in California, Ohio, and Florida, the 3 states where he had the strongest connections and knew the terrain best. Investigators would later confirm victims from Los Angeles, where he targeted women in South Central and around MacArthur Park. From Cleveland, where he hunted in the neighborhoods around East 93rd Street and Kinsman Avenue. From Tampa, where he found victims along Nebraska Avenue and in the neighborhoods of East Tampa. The pace of his crimes seemed to accelerate during the 1990s, perhaps because he felt invincible after evading capture for so long, perhaps because his compulsion was growing stronger and harder to control, perhaps because he simply had more opportunities as he became more practiced at identifying and isolating victims. Some years saw multiple victims in different states as he traveled the country. But age was beginning to catch up with him. By the late 1990s, Samuel was approaching 60 years old. His health was declining from decades of substance use, poor nutrition, and the stress of his transient lifestyle. Diabetes was affecting his vision and mobility. Heart disease was slowing him down. His lifestyle of constant movement was becoming harder to maintain. the pace of his crimes began to slow in the early 2000s, though he remained dangerous. His last confirmed victim was in 2005, when he was 65 years old. After that, his health deteriorated to the point where he could no longer continue his pattern of violence. But by then, the damage was done. 93 victims over 35 years, 93 lives ended, 93 families destroyed. For decades, Samuel Little's crimes went unconnected. But advances in DNA technology would finally begin to bring his past to light. In 2012, detectives in Los Angeles were working cold cases involving 3 women whose bodies had been found between 1987 and 1989. DNA evidence from these scenes had been preserved, though no matches had been found. When investigators ran the DNA through updated databases, they got a hit. Samuel Little, who was then in prison in California on a substance-related charge. The match was strong enough to warrant further investigation. Detective Mitzi Roberts of the Los Angeles Police Department began building a case. She reviewed the original crime scene reports, interviewed witnesses, and gathered new evidence. What she found suggested that these weren't isolated incidents. There might be a pattern here that nobody had previously recognized. The investigation into Samuel Little required painstaking work. Detective Roberts and her team had to connect crimes that spanned decades and crossed state lines. They had to find evidence in cases that had long gone cold. They had to track down witnesses who had moved on with their lives. In 2014, prosecutors felt they had enough evidence to charge Samuel Little with 3 counts of causing the deaths of 3 women: Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. All 3 women had been found in Los Angeles between 1987 and 1989. All 3 had been strangled. All 3 cases had gone cold until DNA technology brought them back to life. Samuel Little was arrested and charged. But at this point, investigators had no idea of the true scope of his crimes. They believed they were dealing with a man who had harmed 3 women over a 2-year period. The reality was far more horrifying. After his arrest, Samuel Little was not immediately cooperative. He maintained his innocence in the Los Angeles cases and refused to provide information about his past. But in 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland developed a strategy that would break through Samuel's defenses. Ranger Holland understood psychology. He knew that many violent offenders have a need to be recognized, to have their accomplishments acknowledged. He approached Samuel not with hostility, but with curiosity. He asked Samuel to tell his story. He listened without judgment. He let Samuel talk. And Samuel began to talk, and talk, and talk. What started as discussions about the Los Angeles cases quickly expanded into something unprecedented. Samuel Little began confessing to crimes across the country. But these weren't vague admissions. They were detailed, specific accounts that included information only the perpetrator would know. He described victims by their physical appearance. He recalled the cities where he had taken their lives. He remembered details about locations, about the clothes they wore, about the conversations they had. His memory was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. Texas Ranger Holland conducted more than 700 hours of interviews with Samuel. During these sessions, Samuel confessed to harming 93 women over 35 years. He would sketch portraits of his victims from memory, creating haunting images that investigators would later use to identify previously unknown cases. The FBI assembled a team to verify Samuel's confessions. This wasn't a simple task. Many of the cases he described had never been reported as suspicious. Bodies had been found, and deaths attributed to other causes. Some victims had never been identified at all. But as investigators checked his accounts against old records, the details matched. A woman found in a ravine in New Mexico in 1993. The case had been ruled an overdose, but Samuel's description of how he had placed her there matched the scene. A Jane Doe discovered in Mississippi in 1977. Samuel provided details about her appearance and location that aligned with the case file. One by one, cold cases began to close. Families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones finally got answers. Jane Does were given their names back. Deaths that had been attributed to accidents or natural causes were reclassified. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Samuel's confessions was his artistic ability. Despite his failing eyesight, he could sketch detailed portraits of his victims from memory. Some of these crimes had occurred 40 or 50 years earlier, yet he remembered their faces with remarkable clarity. The FBI released these sketches to the public, hoping to generate new leads and identify unknown victims. The response was overwhelming. Tips came in from across the country. Families recognized the drawings. More cases were solved. As of 2019, the FBI had confirmed 50 of Samuel's 93 confessions through matching evidence, witness accounts, and case files. They believe many of the remaining confessions are also truthful, but confirming cases from the 1970s and 80s is challenging when evidence has been lost and witnesses are deceased. Samuel Little's trial for the 3 Los Angeles cases began in 2014, before his extensive confessions. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence connecting him to the harm caused to Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. The defense argued that DNA evidence alone wasn't sufficient, that the cases were too old, that witnesses' memories couldn't be trusted after so many years. But the jury saw through these arguments. On September 25, 2014, after deliberating for just over a day, the jury found Samuel Little guilty on all 3 counts. The verdict brought some measure of justice for 3 families who had waited 27 years for answers. In November 2014, Samuel Little was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At 74 years old, with declining health, everyone knew he would spend his remaining days in prison. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of understanding the full scope of his crimes. As Samuel's confessions were verified, additional charges followed. In 2018, he was charged with the 1994 case of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas. He pleaded guilty and received another life sentence. In Ohio, he was charged in connection with the cases of 3 women from the Cleveland area. He pleaded guilty to these charges as well, adding more life sentences to his record. Each conviction brought closure to families, but it also highlighted the tragedy of how long these cases had remained unsolved. Many of Samuel's victims had been dismissed by society, their disappearances barely investigated. Only now, decades later, were they receiving the attention and justice they deserved. Samuel Little spent his final years in a California prison, confined to a wheelchair as his health deteriorated. He suffered from diabetes and heart disease. His mobility was severely limited, but his mind remained sharp enough to continue providing details about his crimes. He gave numerous interviews from prison, speaking with journalists and documentary producers. In these interviews, he showed no remorse for his actions. He spoke about his victims in clinical terms, as if discussing objects rather than human beings. He seemed to enjoy the attention his confessions brought him. Psychologists who studied him suggested he had severe personality disorders, a complete lack of empathy, and a compulsive need for control. He saw his victims as means to satisfy his urges, not as people with lives, families, and futures. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little passed away in a California hospital at the age of 80. The cause was complications from long-term health issues. He had been serving multiple life sentences and would have remained in prison regardless of his health. His passing brought an end to one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. But for the families of his victims, his ending could never truly bring closure. Too many years had passed. Too many questions remained unanswered. Some of his 93 confessed cases remain unverified. Some victims have never been identified. Some families are still searching for loved ones who disappeared decades ago, not knowing if their missing person might be among Samuel's unnamed victims. Samuel Little's crimes expose catastrophic failures in America's justice system. He was arrested more than 100 times throughout his life for various offenses. Multiple times he was charged with crimes against women, but released due to drop charges, lack of evidence, or plea deals. The problem wasn't lack of warning signs, it was lack of follow-through. The system kept giving him chances, and each time, he used that freedom to harm more people. Perhaps the most painful lesson from this case is how society failed Samuel's victims long before he found them. These were women struggling with substance issues, women in dangerous survival situations, women experiencing homelessness. When they disappeared, their cases received minimal attention. Many of Samuel's victims were classified as runaways or assumed to have left by choice. Some deaths were quickly attributed to substances or accidents without thorough investigation. The message was clear. These lives mattered less to the system. This must change. Every missing person deserves a thorough investigation. Every unexplained ending deserves scrutiny. Every life has equal value, regardless of circumstances. Samuel Little was finally caught because of DNA technology that didn't exist during most of his criminal years. This case demonstrates why cold case units are crucial, why evidence must be preserved, and why ongoing technological advances must be applied to unsolved cases. Across America, there are thousands of cold cases sitting in evidence rooms. Some of them could be solved with modern DNA analysis. Some of them might reveal patterns that weren't visible decades ago. The work must continue. How do we prevent another Samuel Little? It starts with taking all reports of violence seriously. It continues with better communication between law enforcement agencies. It includes supporting vulnerable populations so they're less susceptible to predators. We must fund victim services, substance recovery programs, and housing assistance. We must train police to recognize patterns across jurisdictions. We must maintain and improve DNA databases. We must never dismiss a missing person report because of who that person was or how they lived. This story reminds us that justice delayed is not justice denied if we refuse to give up. Share this documentary to raise awareness about the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable. Subscribe to stay informed about cases that need our attention. And remember, staying vigilant and supporting those in need can prevent future tragedies.